caffeinated coffee, and that's, of course, Maxwell House. And Maxwell House coffee was extremely popular in America, made and bought by the Postum Company, General Foods, in the 1920s. And it was in the 1920s that they harkened back to the famous statement by Teddy Roosevelt the first time he tasted Maxwell House coffee in the Maxwell House. He said, "My, this is good to the last drop." And the Post people turned that into the most famous slogan in American history. So Post, in his anti-coffee company, sold millions and millions of cans of Maxwell House coffee. And it's still, I think, even today, I would say what's number one today? Probably Folgers. I think Folgers maybe. And then, what do you think is two? Probably Maxwell House. I mean, it's certainly a good guess. A couple of side notes here. Instant coffee was invented for the soldiers in World War I by the George Washington Coffee Company. So the soldiers called it a cup of George. And then in World War II, soldiers called G.I. Joe. So then coffee became cup of Joe. But what happened in World War II is really amazing. The American government was so obsessed that every soldier would have hot, fresh coffee. And they went and set up all these coffee roasting plants all over Europe and also in Asia. By the end of the war, the United States military was grinding 87 tons of coffee per day. Wow. Per day. This gives you an idea of the enormity of the size of the force that was in Europe, and then at least that in the Pacific Theater, of course. Now, one thing that is so important with coffee and its development is, in America, is advertising. Coffee is one of those items people can live without, right? Well, maybe not everybody, right? Some people have to have coffee. But it is a discretionary thing, right? Whether you drink 1 cup or, it depends on cost, but also whether you are, whether you're psychologically thinking about coffee, right? So what these coffee companies did very early on is when radio came on, is they started heavily advertising in radio. And so Maxwell House was kind of the most famous of all these. You know what their biggest program was, Maxwell House? The biggest radio program actually of all time. It's called Amos and Andy. And Amos and Andy went on the air for Maxwell House for years and years and years and years. Now, this is hard for me to believe, but I have people that knew this and did this. They said that theaters would not, in New York, for example, Broadway shows would not start until after Amos and Andy was on. But movie theaters in small towns would, before the movie came on, would go plug into the radio and play Amos and Andy, because people wouldn't come, they wouldn't come to see the movie if they were going to miss an episode of Amos and Andy. Now on my MP3 player, I downloaded hundreds of these Amos and Andy shows and listened to them, primarily with my son Taylor. The writing is so brilliant, you just can't imagine anything as good as Amos and Andy. Jimmy.
Was that still true in the South, though?
Well, yeah, now that's exactly. This is...
Because, you know, they wouldn't let
yeah.
anything that had
Yeah, I know.
colored actors or actresses, because they called it back then,
Well,
they showed in the
and
South.
Freeman Godston and Charles Corral, you know, were white men playing. So there is this blackface kind of thing where this is okay because they're somehow entertaining, you see. Entertainers, they thought of black people as entertainers or athletes or this kind of thing. And so I think they did. Some of this was in the South too.
Wouldn't that be like minstrel shows, Paul? Because
Yeah.
it was white actors playing back.
That is absolutely correct. And in fact, Maxwell House spent a lot of money just but see again, this was the genius of Post and then his daughter Margie Merriweather Post. They understood the importance of advertising. So speaking of this minstrel show, they went on the air with a minstrel show in 1933 called the Maxwell House Showboat. The musical Showboat had come out, and so they took that idea and turned it into a variety show. And it was the same kind of thing. By the way, this is an aside, but I think you'll find it of great interest. There's two characters, iconic American characters, that still harken back to these kind of racist days. And one of those is Aunt Jemima, and the other one is Uncle Ben. So this morning I was doing some reading on this. It turns out that Aunt Jemima was a creation of advertising creation, marketing creation of Quaker Oats. They owned this name, and they hired this lady. They came to Dallas. Quaker Oats people came to Dallas. Now I give you why would they come to Dallas? Well, because they were looking for a certain person. And they hired this lady. See if I can find her name. Lillian Richards. They hired her as Aunt Jemima. And so Aunt Jemima, now she wasn't the first Aunt Jemima. The first Aunt Jemima was in St. Louis, but she became the most famous, the most iconic of the Aunt Jemimas. Lillian Richards, she was from Hawkins, Texas. So on this thin thread of a connection between Lillian Richards being Aunt Jemima and having been born and raised there, Hawkins, Texas now is the pancake capital. In the 1930s, Forrest Mars. Anybody ever heard of Forrest Mars? Ever heard of Mars bars? M&M?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. So Forrest Mars went to England, and there he learned about this concept of rice conversion, where you take rice, which takes a long time to cook. So it's called parboiling, but there was a special process in England that he bought and brought back and set up a plant in Houston, Texas. And Forrest Mars said that Uncle Ben was one of the rice farmers down there in South Texas who grew rice for what became then in 1946 Uncle Ben's rice. So it is possible, if you want to look at it a certain way, that both Aunt Jemima, the iconic Aunt Jemima, and the iconic Uncle Ben both were from Texas. So Maxwell House later in the 30s switched to Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. Now, Sam and I remember this. The rest of you are too young. Chris, you're just a kid. Oh, you do? Do you remember Charlie McCarthy? Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. Anyway, again, if you listen to these radio shows, Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, it's stunning. But in this case, Edgar Bergen wrote most of it. Amazingly clever and fantastic. And then also Fanny Brice, Baby Snook's character was also on the air. So all these famous radio shows were on the air for Maxwell House. One more little detail here, and then I've got to quit. David, I understand time. So the British were over in India, and they were controlling India, and they couldn't bring enough troops from England to control this huge country of India. So they had hired a lot of locals. And one of the problems they had is that these English troops would wear their wool outfits, very hot and so forth. But the Indian troops, they wore white. But the problem was, particularly up in they called the Punjab and up in Pakistan and so on, which again was part of India in those days, the white very quickly in that dusty climate would get very dirty. And so somebody came up with an innovation, and they said, let's take that white cloth and dye it in coffee. Now the word up there for coffee is khaki. So you see what I'm wearing today? I'm wearing my khakis, right? I'm wearing my coffee dyed pants. And there's quite a range, by the way. You can have lighter and darker. Sometimes they kind of go off into the green. But the word khaki is very, very well known to us. But it comes from this Indian word for coffee, which is what they used to dye with. Amazing. Now I have a cliffhanger. But this cliffhanger is for 2 weeks. I'm going to give you 2 weeks to work on this one, because this is a really tough one, okay? Dallas, Texas is known for the founding creation, birthplace of 3 great American institutions. I would say iconic institutions. 3 great institutions. I want you to see if you can figure out any of these 3 institutions. And I'm going to get into this on the last Sunday. Next week I'm doing sugar and chocolate. Oh, yeah, that's good. And then I'm going to then get into the refreshment side of the equation and talk about soda, water, and popular soft drinks and so on. And that's good. But anyway, 3 great iconic institutions that came out of Dallas, Texas, and I'm going to give you a huge, colossal hint. 2 of them came out of Oak Cliff, Texas. So good luck on that. All right, we'll see ya. I'll hang around if anybody has any coffee. I should give up. If anybody has any questions.